of people. Everyone rushing to the door when they hear that you're about to start talking. I'm not kidding. Actually, I was just checking who's there, and then suddenly there are like 10 more people joining in.
We have now 43.
So yeah, whenever you feel ready, I think we should not, your time is most valuable, and we should not steal your time by keeping you waiting, twiddling the thumb. So yes.
Hey, thank you all so much. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining. This is definitely not, I look forward to spending as much time today in the first session. Hugely appreciate Serc's effort in putting this workshop together. The program is super rich. Well, for those of you who may not know about the Asean Policy Network or the SERD Policy Network here, we started it, actually SERD Policy Network is appropriate because we have Timor-Leste also as part of SERD. The idea was born, I think about 3 years ago, and I'm immensely glad and greatly appreciate the Serc team's effort over that period, the last 3 years, to give it real shape and to have a lot of things happening as part of the policy network. The idea is basically to have, all of you, all colleagues in Southeast Asia Department as well as CRCD, STCC, in some cases, the other departments also do fantastic knowledge work. OGC, for instance, TD. So we thought we should create a platform where people within ADB can collaborate on ideas. Of course, everyone is super busy with our quote-unquote day job, particularly those who are doing work on projects, whether processing, implementation, or the departments that I mentioned. Obviously, there is core work program that the departments have. So we thought, in addition to that, a lot of you are doing wonderful work. There have been, if you look at the volume of knowledge products that we do every year as part of technical assistance, as part of staff's own work, is phenomenal. So we thought, why not give it a kind of a more structured shape and bring together, create this network of not just economists, but also others, like, for example, take energy policy and transport, finance, climate change, and so on. Why don't we create this platform? So I'm immensely happy that Serc has given it, real solid shape and taken it forward. So greatly appreciate Alfredo's coordination and support, and Bernard and Dulce in particular, and others who worked with them in taking it forward. So, and this workshop that we are going to have starting now until tomorrow evening, the topics are so timely, and the way they've organized also, I greatly appreciate. We start with first finance in terms of what's happening, what are the sector dynamics, and within that there is so much talk about green recovery. What are some of the thoughts, what are the opportunities that we can see in the region? Already our teams, Anuj and Pradeep in particular, have done in Thailand with a very small amount of technical assistance. Bulk of its staff time led to the issuance of $1.4 billion of green bonds, and that's phenomenal. That's actually what started as knowledge work. Now we are handholding them, the PDMO and the National Housing Authority, if I got the name right, because it's not just issuance of bonds, it's also to make sure that the proceeds follow all the guidelines that go along with the issuance of green bonds. And there is a Green Finance Recovery Strategy publication that Anuj coordinated and was released by VP Saeed at an OECD event that now we've been participating, I think, 2 years in a row, where Asean Southeast Asia has been given a lot of visibility. Then we will go into today into small and medium enterprises, which have been so badly hit in the COVID pandemic. clearly we need to look at what is happening, what have we learned. And here, ERCD colleagues, my former colleague in Ore, Shige Shinosaki, has done very interesting survey work. So what are we learning from it? And then you'll have also Kwong speaking on SMEs, particularly in Vietnam. And then we will go into talking about labor markets, people. The next two sessions, session 3, session 4, are about people. What is the impact on labor markets? And particularly again in Southeast Asia, if you look at the impact of the pandemic, large job losses. You begin to wonder, it's not an exaggeration to say that I have sleepless nights. What is going to happen? When will the economy start recovering? When will those people who have lost their jobs, particularly in the informal sectors, particularly, take tourism, for instance. It's not just the core tourism, but also a number of other ancillary activities that support tourism. All of that is gone. And it's going to take a significant amount of time to come back. So what's going to be the impact on labor markets? We will hear from colleagues. Samir Katiwada and Sani are going to be talking about labor market dynamics. What are we learning? Then going into impact on people, the poor and the vulnerable. We have very interesting papers as well. And a key aspect of it, in addition to looking at poor and vulnerable, impact on to understand what are the gender dynamics. There is so much that has always been going on the gender front in terms of dynamics, that is. Now, COVID has unleashed, in some cases, kind of worrisome trends. We know that gender-based violence has been a problem that countries are grappling with. And we will hear from Liz in terms of what are we looking at, what are the differential impacts. And by the way, she had organized a couple of months back with UN Women, very useful workshop on GBV, gender-based violence in the Philippines. Although the topic that she'll be covering tomorrow is on understanding overall impact. And with Amir Jilani, we will hear in terms of what efforts are being made to reach the poor. And then the finale sessions, 5 and 6 tomorrow, will go into the impact of COVID control measures and how are systems or sectors responding. So we'll hear on health sector first, and then in terms of clearly countries need to take measures. They have costs as well as benefits, and we need to give through our tools findings or recommendations rather that countries can use to move forward. And here I particularly and I would say immensely appreciate the collaboration between ERCD and SERD. ERCD colleagues have brought in so much real-time inputs into the process, which has been very helpful for Philippines in particular to make key decisions in terms of opening up the economy. So we'll hear from after we'll hear from David Reitzer on the cost-benefit analysis of COVID control measures. And then finally, one of the most fascinating topics always, I think, but now in the context of COVID, that has emerged is big data. What are we learning from systems and data that have been around, but we have not yet made big use of that big data. But now clearly there is an imperative. There are significant opportunities. So what can we do? So two fascinating presentations on Earth observation tools. And from STCC, Paulo Manunta will be speaking. And then we have Tony Gill will be speaking on what's happening in GMS countries through the use of GIS. So it's a fantastic program. And I think most of you would be familiar with the PACER dialogue, the Policy Actions for COVID Economic Recovery dialogue that Serc had organized. 12 very meaningful value-adding dialogues have taken place for the benefit of the capacity building program participants from the sub-regional programs that we have in Southeast Asia and plus East Asia. Now, building on that, the economists network within SERD had done early stage impact assessments of COVID. Each country had produced a very helpful paper, which went into to provide inputs for the CPRO loans in the 5 countries, and in other cases for the ADO updates, as well as other work we are doing, like, for example, health projects, for instance, in other countries. And then now this comes as the third innovation, I would say, in terms of what we can learn from each other internally based on the phenomenal amount of work that's being done. So let me pause there. I'm actually very keen on hearing the speakers, but greatly appreciate Bernard for putting this together, and to each and every one of the speakers who clearly know they've done all the work, but also to present means it's setting aside valuable time and preparing, and also spending the time here. So greatly appreciate. Thank you so much. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Rajmesh. That was, extremely inspiring, and we are now re-energized and will strive for doing even more. And thank you so much for those great remarks, and we really appreciate your continued support and guidance in our work in this area particularly. Next, may I invite Alfredo, Director of SERC, to give some introductory remarks as well.
Yes, not very briefly, because DG has introduced already the whole program. So I just would like to really thank our colleagues from SDCC and ERCD, and of course, once again, to all our economists, because everyone has been working incredibly hard to put this together. There's a lot of very good inputs, very interesting topics, as DG already mentioned. And you may recall that in SERD, we wanted really to work more and better with ERCD and SDCC, being as one ADB. I think this has been working better than ever during 2020 under COVID, and this is the proof of this. And we would like, we have 2 types of knowledge sharing events. Some of them are organized by this policy network, as mentioned by DG. Normally, we do it internally in ADB, but of course, what we do internally in ADB is to actually produce something that our clients and our member countries can actually utilize. And that was the case during the first few months, where this policy network produced very significant and interesting products that were later utilized in our CPROs and other products. And we hope that this will be the same. This next 2 days is going to be an internal discussion. I see there's 75 people actually joining already. So I hope it will be very enriching, diverse. I encourage everyone to really, truly participate. But we would like to pick up ideas from here to do more operations in ADB. And of course, maybe more knowledge events similar to what we use with the PACER dialogues, and maybe a second series of the PACER dialogues starting from next year. So we are looking forward to all the internal discussions in ADB, which are more important than ever, because you are working, some of you a bit more isolated. So it's very, very important really to have these discussions. So once again, thank you, everyone. Thank you, DG, for joining us. And I encourage everyone to stay as many sessions as you can, of course. Some of you are more interested in one or in another. But if you don't, we have organized this in a way that people can participate for the US. Some of them, that's where we have tomorrow morning sessions. And most of them are in the afternoon, because we have several speakers actually speaking from Europe. So thanks very much to all. And back to you, Bernard.
Thank you so much, Alfredo. That's very good, and definitely one of the key goals of this this workshop. It's not just about sharing information. It's also we see it as an opportunity for, in a sense, networking, right? Because one of the things I think we have been missing, and that sort of like hamper, the cooperation is, everyone is working from home. And there really is, the usual interaction, meeting each other for coffee, having lunch, and so on. So one of the ways we try to do this is to bring different people together, and this is why, when we structure the workshop, we try to put people from different departments, making the presentation, so that people can sort of see, the different kind of approaches that the people from ERCD, people from SDCC, and people from SERD. We are all working together, very much a one ADB approach, and this is sort of like another way to help further do that. We try to put in some new innovation, so we are trying to do some sort of a virtual coffee break later, right? Because, you know, as we all know, many times people say the most interesting part of a workshop is like, you know, when we have this sort of conversation over coffee. So we try to recreate that later. So if those, you know, bear with us if there's some technical glitches. We are still like figuring out some of these things, but that is like sort of the idea we try to bring. So without much ado, let me introduce you all to the presenter in the first session. First up, we will have Grace Shu Tian from ERCD. She's she's in charge of she's working together with Tong Park on the Asia Bonds Online. I used to do also the Asia Bonds Online, so definitely I'm very excited to know what's happening in the bonds market. I know that, you know, as we all know, during the early days of the COVID crisis, there were a lot of outflows, capital outflows from the region. I think the market now has improved, but we'll listen to Grace. You know, and she also will talk a little bit about the green bonds market. So I think that's also something that's very interesting. And our second presenter for the first session today is actually Anuj, my great colleague here in SERD, and he's doing a lot on green recovery. So I think there's sort of the work that is finding out new ways to finance the green recovery, like green finance. So that's actually something that's very interesting as well. So these are our first two presenters. Before I before I invite Grace to make her first presentation, may I invite you all to participate in the poll. So we have created a poll. All you have to do is look at the chat box, click on the link, fill in the answer. The first question, you can have multiple answers. The second question, you will have only one answer. So then you can do it, and then we'll share the result at the end of the presentation. So I think this is also another thing we are trying out to see, you know, if we can get greater participation and help us start the discussion. So first, let me invite Grace to present on the Asian bond market. Grace, please.
Thank you, Bernard. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Grace. Next slide, please. Today, my presentation will cover the following 3 points. So the first one, I would like to share with you the dynamics in ASEAN financial conditions so far this year. Then I will briefly update you on the recent trends in ASEAN bond market development during COVID. And then lastly, I will talk about some new trends in semantic bonds, green bonds, social bonds. I think this naturally bridges to Anuj's green finance presentation. Next slide, please. This slide contains my key points for the first topic, dynamics in financial conditions. Roughly, since the global financial markets has a turmoil in March, we see that financial conditions in ASEAN markets have largely recovered. In particular, we can see that foreign capital flows declined modestly, but recently we see the capital inflows recovered in Q3. Equity and bond market also rallied, but still not fully recovered. And then we see ASEAN currencies strengthened against the USD. So in general, ASEAN financial markets demonstrate resilience during this year. And we believe that the recovery in financial conditions is supported by the global easing monetary stance, which provided accommodative liquidity condition. Next slide, please. This slide actually shows the performance of equity and bond market. On the left-hand side, what we can show is the major Asian equity market rallied since Q2. So after the market turmoil in March, we see that actually ASEAN 5 markets, the orange line, recovered, but it's still far below its level at the beginning of the year. So what we can say is the investment sentiment recovered is still not fully recovered. This can also be tracked in the bond market. So on the right-hand side of this slide, we see it's actually the bond yield, which captures the risk premium. So the higher means more risk averse of the investors. So we see the similar patterns. In March, the risk premium peaked, and then after that, the risk premium declined. But still, in many ASEAN markets, we see that the yield premium is still higher than its original level at the beginning of the year. Next slide, please. Yep. Yeah, here. How come? Next slide, please. The flow. Yeah. Okay. Similar message can be told from the capital flow patterns. On the left-hand side is the general capital flows of different categories. What I would like to focus on is the last two bars. So Q1 and Q2 this year, we see the overall capital flows. We see that FDI declined steadily, but we do see that starting from Q2, actually we see the portfolio equity and portfolio debt, which is the orange bar and then the gray bar. In the last two bars, actually we can see a recovery in portfolio investment. So and then if we turn to the right hand side chart, we see a higher frequency portfolio investment. We can see that actually during the Q3 we see a steady capital inflows in the regional bond market. And then equity market, actually, we do see a capital outflow in Q3, but very recently, just this week, I think at least 2 or 3 of the regional market already see equity market inflows due to the improvement in investment sentiment. So next slide, please. Yeah, this chart actually shows the currency performance. I think the right-hand side is the ASEAN currencies. We see that since Q2, basically from May, we see that ASEAN currencies has been strengthened continuously. So largely this is because of a weakened USD, but we do see that ASEAN currencies demonstrate resilience during the crisis this year. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is the last slide of my first point. So this slide shows that we believe the improvement in financial conditions is largely supported by the global easing monetary stance. On the left-hand side, we show the policy rate has been declined significantly across Asia. And then on the right-hand side, we see that the borrowing rates for key financial institutions has declined significantly across Asia. So this provided enough liquidity in the market and then helped support the investment sentiment in the financial sector. Next slide, please. This slide summarizes my key points in the ASEAN bond market development. So first, we see that ASEAN local currency bond market continues to expand since Q2. Actually, Q1, we see contraction. This is because market sentiment improved, and then foreign holding declined in Q2, but to different expand across ASEAN local currency bond market. And then we do see that domestic institutional investors like banks, insurance companies provided support to the regional local currency bond market. This actually emphasized the importance of a strong domestic investor base in bond market development. Next slide, please. Yeah, this chart is the general bond market development trend. The blue line is the local currency bond market size, outstanding size, and then the yellow line, yellow line, red line. Red line is the foreign currency bond market size. Red line is using the right-hand side axis. So we see a local currency bond market continues to grow, but continues to grow in Q2 and Q3 actually. In Q1 we see a contraction, but in Q3 we see that local currency bond market growing by nearly 5% Q-on-Q and 11% year-on-year. In Q3, this is largely supported by a huge financing demand in the region. And then next slide, please. Yep. This year we see an increasing financing need by the public sector. So on the left-hand side, the three bars shows that during the first 3 quarters this year, we see government bond market. It's continuing to expand. So we see the share government bond market share expand from 63% in Q1 to 64% in Q1. And then also many of the regional governments, they are going for local currency bond market financing. So we do see a slightly increase in local currency financing in the regional bond markets, which can be tell in the right-hand side 3 bars. Next slide, please. This slide actually shows, as we can see, actually, because of the lower policy rate and the lower interest rates, actually we do see the bond yield decreased in this year. So the blue bar actually sets the benchmark, which is the starting level of this year bond yields. And then the red triangle captures the most recent bond yield levels. So we see it is all below the beginning of the year. But what I would like to emphasize is please see the orange dot. The orange dot is actually the bond yield as of the end of Q1. So which is at the end of the market turmoil. So we do see in a few of the Asian bond market, we see bond yield increase during the market turmoil, although all the authorities has cut their policy rate. In particular, like Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, we do see bond yield increase. And then many people may argue this is because of the relative weak interest investment grade. But I would say it also emphasized some other important message. So if you see the two box I highlighted, Philippines BBB+, Thailand BBB+, but Philippines bond yield is higher than the beginning of the year during the market turmoil, although there is a policy rate cut, but Thailand is not that obvious. So I would believe this has something to do with a deeper financial markets. So Philippines bond market is still much smaller than Thailand. So I would say there is also some kind of implications on the depths of the bond market. Next slide, please. Here, a similar message. This chart actually shows the foreign holding levels in the local currency bond market, local currency government bond market. We see that Indonesia and the Philippines record continuing decline in foreign holdings throughout the year. Actually, these two markets are relatively small compared to other Asian markets like Malaysia and Thailand. So I believe this also has some implications on the depths of the bond markets. So more larger bond market definitely becomes more resilient during market turmoils. That's next slide, please. Yep. This slide actually shows the importance of a domestic investor base. We see that there is in some markets foreign holdings, foreign investors, they sell off. So who are the buyers? Actually, we see in Indonesia, I think the insurance companies increased their holdings. And then in Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam, we see that domestic banks increase their holdings. So we believe if the ASEAN bond market, they are able to develop a stronger domestic base, the market entirely will be more resilient to external shocks. So this is the last slide of the second point. Next slide, please. This slide actually summarizes my key points of recent trends in sustainable bond development. In 2020, actually the COVID hit the vulnerable groups harder. So there is an increasing awareness on social bonds, so instruments with a social impacts. We see a surge in social bond issuance across the region and also across the global bond market. And then we also see a decline in green bond issuance. Asia has become the second largest social bond market following Europe so far. And Asian's social bond market is dominated by public sector issuers. So next slide, please. This chart just shows the development of two different types of instruments. The left-hand side is the green bond. The green bond market. So green bond market has been developing very fast, and then Asia becomes a key players following Europe. But this year on the right hand side, we see a decrease in the issuance. So but the interest is still there. Next slide, please. What we do see is, while there is a decline in green bond issuance, there is a decline in sustainable bond increase. Sustainable bond means instruments with both environmental and social impacts. So sustainable bond issuance also declines, but we do see that social bonds seems to gain increasing attention worldwide. Next slide, please. And Asia is picking up rapidly in social bond issuance. So on the left-hand side, we see that Asia is now becoming the second largest market for social bonds. And then on the right-hand side, we see that actually Asia's social bond market now is leading by Korea and Japan. Unlike green bonds, actually, the pattern is quite different. Next slide, please. Yeah, this chart actually shows the structure. So it seems that Asian social bonds is heavily weighted by to social public sector issuers with nearly 80% being issued by the public sector. This number is higher than 70% globally. So that means Asia's social bond market is more public sector dominated compared to the global average. And then at the same time, private sector issuance is also limited compared to global level. Next slide, please. Yeah, actually, this is my key points from the three aspects. I would look forward to hear Anush's green finance presentation. Here is a very five-second commercial. Yes, I'm working on Asian Bonds Online, which is database for ASEAN Plus 3 bond market, and then I take over it from Bernard, which made a huge makes a good contribution to the development of Asian Bonds Online. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Grace. So great presentation, so informative, and so precisely on time. We were timing you, and I think you were like, you know, you must have practiced before to, to cover everything exactly 15 minutes. So that was very great. So, you know, people, if you have any question, I suggest we can put it in the chat box, and then at the end we can collect and then sort of post a question during the Q&A. But before that, let me invite Anush. Anush, who of course has just recently released his publication on green finance, and it's a very exciting work about the opportunities for green finance in Southeast Asia. So without much ado, Anush, can you tell us about green finance?
Thanks, Bernard. Can you hear me clear?
Yes, loud and clear.
And can you see the slides?
Your presentation is coming through as well.
Excellent, great. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here today, and great to be part of this workshop. So I'm going to try and give a little bit of a flavor of maybe both the challenges as well as what's emerging on the green finance recovery side, and quickly take you through that in about 10-15 minutes. You'll see the cover here on the first slide, which is the green finance strategies for post-COVID-19 recovery in Southeast Asia. Released just a few weeks ago, and a lot of the information that we've got in the slides over here is from the book, which is based on some of the work that we are already doing in the Innovation Hub in Southeast Asia, as well as some other things that we are proposing. So it's examples and concepts. Just as a very, I've always tried to sort of set the preamble for it because I just want to sort of, emphasize the relative need in the region. And so there's a lot of discussion about, how well Southeast Asia and East Asia have been doing in the SDGs. And, certainly if you look at that light green line over here, you can see that there has been good work, this one over here, work done by countries in Asia. There's also the ASEAN renewable energy target of 23%. So as a body, the ASEAN is trying to do good things. And then efficiency targets have been achieved. So they're all committed to the Paris Agreement, all the countries in ASEAN. And these are all good signs in terms of their efforts to improve SDG targets as well as climate change targets. The problem is it's very small compared to what's needed. And if you look at that box over here, the red box, which shows you some of the SDGs, especially on climate action and water and consumption, the progress isn't great, and in fact, it's regressive in some cases. It's not actually moving well, which is a problem. And you'll see on the right-hand side that there are a lot of indicators in terms of what's actually happening with marine populations, which have declined 49%, loss of coral reefs 90%, dead zones, and of course, what we see visibly is the air pollution in Asia, with 6 out of 10 countries with the highest number of deaths in Asia. Basic sanitation is an issue. And if you look at the top line targets, it's not the good news that's coming out, it's the bad news. And that is the amount of plastic in the oceans, a lot of which is in our countries in Southeast Asia, 8 million tons, the number of people dying, a number of which, majority of which is in Asia. And then the single biggest issue, which is that we are completely on track for disaster, which is 3.2 degrees increase in temperature. That's where we are heading rather than the 1.5 ideally. And so it's not the 2-degree impact that we are now looking at, and it's actually this. We need to cut global emissions by 7.6% every year. And this is an average across countries, so it's going to be pretty tough on many of our countries. So we are not in a good space in terms of green and climate, whatever little things are being done. It's getting worse. With COVID-19, the single biggest issue is that the economic downturns, which you'll see first time contraction in, I think, 6 decades in Asia, 0.7%, but Southeast Asia much worse, according to our own data. Now, I quote this because this immediately has an impact in terms of the budgets available to spend on climate, green, and SDG targets. We already had extremely tough financing gaps earlier. So in Asia as a whole, you had, and this is a few years ago, 459 billion a year. In Southeast Asia, the financing gap already was something like 60%, which needed to come from private capital, and that's not coming, with risk perceptions getting worse, and therefore the amount of funding which is going to go into green and climate is hugely at risk. So I set this backdrop because the point is this, which is we need to attract private capital from all sources. And I'll stop here for a second. When we talk about private capital from all sources, it's not PPPs. In fact, PPPs is not the answer to everything else. It's a small part, and I think everybody acknowledges that. It's the funds, it's the pension funds, it's the insurance funds. That's where we need the money to come from. And you can see the estimations are, I think, 30 to 60 trillion in pension funds globally, which is available. But how do you make that flow into the region, especially ASEAN, when domestic resource mobilization is pretty small, the amount of funding available from governments is pretty small, and it's getting smaller. So this is where we are today if we are trying to stimulate capital into recovery and green recovery, which is the planning for green and SDGs in infrastructure is complicated. We don't see it being heavily mainstreamed in projects. So good discussions, good top line, mention of Paris, but how does it mainstream? That's not happening. There's a massive shortage of these projects which can accelerate green targets. Financing instruments need to be broadened. A project by project approach is perhaps wrong now if you want to scale up and not be on a track for disaster. The 3.2 degrees, government capacities are very weak, and there's risk averse investors. So, with this whole focus on green, so there's a lot of discussion, should we just do a bond versus a green bond? And, that kind of denotes the single biggest issue. What is green finance? And, I'll stop here for a second because there's a lot of confusion about it. We have defined it under the ASEAN facility as this right box over here. Green finance denotes all financing instruments, investments, and mechanisms that contribute to a climate plus approach impacting on this. So what does it mean? This is not climate finance. It's climate finance plus environment finance. So it has to both reduce greenhouse gases, but also have a proactive, measurable impact on air, water, and road space that we use, biodiversity. That's what I put into there. It's also a simpler way to measure finance coming in. So we basically say it's a cross-cutting theme across the SDGs. Governments find it easier to understand. and to put into projects as a target, and especially private capital, there's a lot of money which can flow into it. If you look at the indicator of green finance generally in the world, there's been a record growth in terms of green, sustainable, not just bonds, but also debt, which has been issued. And if you look till 2019, the numbers across the world were staggering. Even in Asia Pacific, the growth in, and I mentioned this because this shows the interest from investors. It's not so much about the bonds, it's the interest from investors that's key. So in 2019, green bonds, were a record high in Asia Pacific, 47 billion, but the ASEAN green bond market, even though it doubled to something like 8 billion last year, is still a very small percentage. And when you look at the 210 billion a year that we need in Southeast Asia alone, it's obviously a very small part. The point is that a lot more can be done because there is interest from investors. Now, what's happening in green finance recovery? So as part of the publication that we've taken out recently, we looked at a number of countries which are already embarked on green recoveries. Of course, top of the line over there is the European Union, which has created these funds to try and catalyze funding into private sector. So they are talking about blended or leveraged approaches over there. The Republic of Korea has a Green New Deal. Indonesia is working on an action plan for plastic pollution. Our country director is co-chair of that. The UK has pledged a clean growth fund to support green growth, and so on. So there are activities happening, especially in Europe, to push for a green recovery, but increasingly, we are also seeing it in the ASEAN. Now, this is the ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility, which was launched last year. That itself has suggestions for how green recovery can be done in Asia, and is putting together, as we speak, since I lead it, a green recovery fund for Southeast Asia in discussions with the Green Climate Fund. That's about $500 million together with GCF and the UK government. That's currently under structuring, and hopefully by first quarter next year, there should be a specific green recovery fund for ASEAN managed by us at the ADB. Now, having said that, let's step back again and look at, when we talk about green recovery, what does it actually mean? So, top line is for green recovery, we should be aligning with this 1, 2, 3 principle. $1 of public sector money to catalyze at least $3 from private capital sources. That's the only way you're going to get the amount of money you need for green recovery, especially now. And in many examples we're working on, that is actually 1, 2, 6 and even more. So this is a conservative 1, 2, 3 principle. Now, how do you do that? So at the extreme left, we've got the project-specific approaches. Let's do a project, let's make it green, let's try and make it catalytic. But is it scalable? And given the time frame, is it the only thing we should be doing? Of course, we should do projects, but you need to do more. So what else? We've got national de-risking approaches. So create national funds for green, which can push green recoveries in those countries. That's one. Regional de-risking facilities, region-wise, a little bit like the EU example where they've created this just transition fund. Thematic approaches. So rather than simply saying a general green fund, do we focus on blue finance or biodiversity, forests, and try to say, here is a model, let's try to create 10 projects. And then capital markets. What's an explicit capital markets approach which can be pushed to try and tap these sources of fund? Now, in almost everywhere, the SERD Innovation Hub and the ASEAN facility is working on these different approaches, which are captured in this book over here, and I'll talk about some of the examples. Starting with the bonds. Now, I think Grace was talking about the growth in bonds in the ASEAN and in Asia. Now, that is true, there is, but at a sovereign level, we don't see that much happening in terms of the scale of financing needed. If you look at some of the bonds that were done last year, there was a sustainability bond done in Philippines by Manila Water. There was another one by DBP. In fact, the Manila Water was this year. Sustainability bonds by DBP was last year. You're talking about 3 to 5 year money, and you're talking about 4 to 5%. But that's commercial money into commercial projects. It's not long tenor, which is what you need for infrastructure. Therefore, you need the sovereigns to be doing a lot more in terms of raising long tenure bonds, green bonds, and then applying those to projects which can leverage that 1, 2, 3 principle that I mentioned earlier. So here are 2 examples. This is something we worked on this year. In August, the Thailand PDMO sustainability bond was issued, which is the first sustainability bond by a sovereign in Southeast Asia post-COVID, and just shows you the interest. This is about $1 billion that was raised. It was 3 times oversubscribed, and it's got an explicit focus on tranche 1, which is for a green infrastructure project, the Orange Line Metro, and also specifically social projects, which is these COVID recovery projects on affordable housing, etc. There is also an NHA social bond, which has already been issued. It's also raised 6.8 billion Thai baht, also very well subscribed. So this already shows you that there's interest. And the interesting thing is, while we were already working from our TA on these 2 bonds, developing the framework, trying to reach out to investors, we were approached by 3 more, 2 in Thailand, 1 in Indonesia. The Indonesia sustainability bond or a transition bond is being structured as we speak. PLN is the entity, and they've already released their statement of intent to do the bond, which DG launched again, I think about a few days ago. So suddenly we see this upsurge of interest in sustainability bonds, and that includes green, of course, but it's largely coming from the sovereigns and SOEs, which is a good way to raise such money. Now, let me talk a little bit about some of the interesting examples. So I've talked about the bonds, let's talk about examples. A great project is the Cambodia Solar Park project. And it's a blend. It really blends our public sector side, which provided a certain amount of money, about 7 million loan. Private sector, PSOD is looking at financing it, and OPPP involved in it. So this is a 60 megawatt park project, which was done in Cambodia. Interestingly, because of this structuring that ADB did along with the sovereign funds, it actually achieved the lowest tariff for a solar project in ASEAN, 39 cents per on the dollar, and that was extremely attractive. Based on this, you'll see over here the Assure program. Now, this Assure program is being developed by OPPP and SEEN for 21 to try and replicate Cambodia Solar across a number of countries. We've already started working on some offshore projects here. So this is demonstration projects which can accelerate more renewable energy projects. ACGF, the logo is all over the slides, and since we run it, the ASEAN facility is one of the only regional vehicles which is focused on green. It's owned by all the countries, ADB manages it. When we launched this last year, we started doing a roadshow to try and raise money for co-financing projects in ACGF. We were shocked. We got about $1.4 billion in co-financing commitments. Already, we've been trying to build a pipeline. It's the single biggest issue is where are the project pipeline. And there are 17 green projects, including oceans financing projects, 4 which have already been approved. So this is a great vehicle to do 3 things. Build the knowledge on green finance. That's how we finance the TAs for the bonds. Provide project preparation. This provided the funding for Cambodia Solar Park project and for some of the other projects we're working on in Cambodia right now for marine, but also to provide de-risking money. So if there is money in it which says we will de-risk a project in such a way, reduce capex, reduce revenue risk on operations, but you must do 3 things. The project must be green. So there is a green framework for this. It must be bankable, and this is mandatory, a bankable criteria for which we manage and run, and have a roadmap for private capital flows. Now, we are a little bit more soft in this and say over the next 7 years, you must be able to either do a bond or refinance out the ACGF money. Now, this is at the moment sovereign, and we are seeing that in the initial projects already the amount we are leveraging is much more than the 1, 2, 3. Now, this is where basically we've been approached. We have been approached by GCF and the UK government and the Italian government to create a green recovery fund, which should really help push the green recovery work in Southeast Asia proactively. Because here we take these models and we go to countries and say, look, here's a model, here is TA money to develop a project, plus we have funding, which is available, co-financing with ADB sovereign, let's develop projects. And the fact that we've had, an interest, already in the, 10 months since we've been operational shows there's a lot of interest. I won't talk about the 2-step loan pricing that ACGF offers, but it's basically part of the whole incentive pricing, cheap for a short time and then becomes more expensive so that it can be refinanced out when the private capital can step in. A couple more examples. One is the Indonesian example, SDG Indonesia 1. This is a national green facility. SDG Indonesia 1 green finance facility conceptually has already been approved by the government. We are working on creating a de-risking facility at the government of Indonesia level under a de-risking partner. Interestingly, as we do the loan processing, $150 million is already been identified to finance around 10 projects, which are worth around $400 to $500 million. So you can already see the multiple.
I think we lost Anoj's voice now. Can you hear Bernard?
Yes, unfortunately, Anuj has. Oops. We have accelerated. We have a hacker in the house. Somebody has taken over. Anuj, are you still there? We can't hear you anymore. Oh, he's on mute now. Anuj is on mute. Maybe he's trying to sort it out. Anuj, can you hear us? No. We missed you for the past few minutes.
Bernard, can you hear me?
Yes, you're back.
Okay, so I don't know what happened
continue.
there. I could hear you, but
no stress, no stress. I think the fossil fuel industry were so worried they hacked your machine and tried to stop you. We persevere.
I'm almost done. I was on my last slide where I was just going to say that in the Green Finance book, we've also spoken about blue credits for oceans health and green securitization. And these are sort of trying to create new concepts to try and push green recoveries in oceans health. It's a little more sophisticated than some of the work we are seeing right now. And interestingly, there's already a conceptual project in Cambodia on basically on blue finance, which could lead to further projects which could be done on oceans. I'll probably stop over there anyway, Bernard, and hand back to you. Probably done my time, and then we can have time for questions and answers. Thanks very much.
Yes, thank you so much. I know that was a great presentation, and that was. I think there'll be many people who would like to learn more, especially since your rates are so low compared to what everybody else is charging. So I think there will be definitely a lot of interest on how people can assess all these funds and so on. So as promised, everyone, I hope you all have done the poll questions so that we can share the results now, and then so that you all can see what has been what's your view. So the first question was, how many of you think that the interest rates will go up? So I have to look a bit closely here and see. So which country are expected to raise their policy rates next year? And then we see that nobody expect interest rate to go up next year. Not nobody, very, very few people. The most popular answer by far. So everyone expect the low interest rate to continue, which is, I guess, is good news for our green finance. The second question, which is of course, I think it's a bit more interesting, is what is the most effective policy to promote green recovery? Here, I think it seems that people in ADB seem to very much favor public investment in green projects. I wonder why. Yeah. So, and then followed by tax incentives. So people seem to be a little bit. Although I didn't put how should we say? Perhaps there we have a little carbon tax, and not so much interest actually in a stronger regulation on the sort of the brown industry. Anyway, so I thought this was like a good way for us to move into our question and answer session. For those who are interested in asking question, you can either type in the question in the chat box, or maybe you can raise your hand so that we can give you an opportunity to ask the question directly to the speakers. Anyone? Otherwise, I will have to make up some questions on the fly. I was just joking. I already have a prepared list of 20 questions for this event. Let's hear from somebody. I mean, those are extremely interesting. But just to get things going, maybe I'll start with asking Grace. Grace, what's the prospect for the bond market next year? Are we going to see a return of the investors, foreign investors, into the bond market here?
Hi, Bernard. Yeah, for the bond market, actually, we are expecting the bond market to continue to expand, maybe not at as fast a pace as this year, but yeah. And then in terms of interest, if the low interest rate continues to pertain, and then also there is signs of recovery, I think yeah, the foreign investment interest will continue to come into the region for higher returns.
Grace? Yes, we have, sorry, I didn't notice. David raised his hand. So David, maybe you want to ask a question.
Thanks, Bernard. Yeah, thank you to both of the presenters. I have a couple of questions for Grace. The first is about the risk premium for bonds from China, PRC, and how to understand that given the relatively strong credit rating. It just seemed a bit anomalous. And then the second is on the social bond issuance from, well, in Asia in general. It seemed like the growth was really driven by Korea. So just wondering whether you have any insights into what has been happening within Korea, and then whether there are lessons or implications for the rest of the region in terms of what we may see in the next year or two. Thank you.
Thanks, David. I think in terms of the Chinese risk premium, it's largely because the China's bond market is quite large, and there are some structural issues still there. Given if you consider the rating, if you consider the size of the market, you may expect some lower premium. But there are also some structural issues in the market in terms of the openness, where the market is still continue to open, and then also in terms of rating standard, transparency. I think the market is still not as mature as many developed bond markets, although the size is already there. So I think that have some implication for the risk premium. In terms of the social bond, yes, I fully agree with you. Korea is leading. So far from the data we can see, many of the Asian social bonds seems to be heavily clustered in this SME sector. And then compared to other regions around the world, we do see that Asia has the potential to do more in other sectors, like health and sanitation, like education. But so far it seems that Asia's social bond heavily tilted towards this SME sector.
Thank you so much, Grace. Let me see if there's anyone else. In the meantime, let me ask Anuj something. Anuj, I think it's very clear. Interest rate, has been low for a long time. Countries need, obviously to boost their economy. Everyone looking at fiscal stimulus, and most of the people here in this workshop also seems to think that public investment. How can we? What more can we do to get the government to do something, right? How do we bring? We have done all we can. I mean, the situation seems to be very very much favorable. The wings definitely behind our back, but I think we have not seen actually very much big sort of public investment project in the green sector. What more can be done, Anuj? I'm in despair here. Please give me some hope.
Yeah, Bernard, I mean, as I think, as you've seen, the bond issuances, a lot of them are by private sector going into private sector projects. But the issue is, as Grace was also saying, a lot of it going to SMEs or, companies. But what you need is a lot more money to flow into infrastructure, utilities, both for jobs and for the green impact, so that it doesn't, it doesn't go off track. Governments have to create visible, big funds where they can raise money explicitly from the markets, whether it's a green or a sustainability bond, doesn't matter. But then they have to apply it smartly to projects, not just keep financing 100% of a project, but link it to accelerated targets. So in Europe, we're already talking about the difference between green and priority green. Not 60% finance of a project should be climate, but 90% should be. Indicator should be harder. Now, if you use money raised by the government, which should be technically cheaper, and then apply it to projects where you can then leverage it for private capital, then you'll get the funds that you need. Right now, a lot of investors globally are worried about the revenue lines, because you can imagine infrastructure revenue lines are a little bit hazy right now. Transport is not necessarily being used. The reasons people go to Thailand, Philippines, all the tourism sector is down. So, how are you going to basically have revenues which can give you the financial returns to a private capital? So governments have to raise those funds and apply it maybe a little to capex for de-risking, but I would say for the next 3 years, apply it for de-risking revenues and use it smartly. So don't provide a grant or a low-cost debt, provide a convertible, which basically says when the project improves in valuation, I convert it into equity and sell it back to a sponsor, maybe. And that's a little bit of the principle that I would say needs to be done. Innovative green de-risking finance done by governments visibly. You'll find if they do that, their ability to raise money from the bonds. Another question which comes up is, why are social bonds rising more than sustainability bonds? Because the social bonds framework, in my view, is a little simpler. It's applied to any one of the SDGs with any kind of a target. Okay, fair enough. But green and sustainability requires very clear green frameworks, green targets. It's a little harder, but that's what you kind of need to do. So, those are the things that need to be done. And you're seeing the beginnings of that happening. So, that's what ADB, I suppose, could do more closely with governments, create these innovative finance mechanisms and funds at the government levels, so that you don't have one Cambodia solar, you have 20, being done in Southeast Asia, which were not bankable and will now attract, private capital. Back to you, Bernard.
Thank you so much, Anuj. And let's see if anyone else wants to ask a question. Jenny Dulce, would you like to ask Anuj something?
Thanks, Bernard. Okay, I'd like to ask Anuj. So you mentioned earlier that we should encourage the private sector to get into green finance. Now, my concern is that how do we encourage them when, as it is, they're hardly hit by the pandemic? How do we encourage them to raise financing when, as mentioned, they're prioritizing staying afloat? And in addition to that, most of the private sectors are undeveloped in our region. So what would be a good step to move forward? Thank you.
Excellent question. Really excellent question. So, I think firstly, let's distinguish between infrastructure and the private sector. I'm not talking about a lot more tourism companies and SMEs and, automobile manufacturers going and raising money. I'm not talking about that at all. I'm talking about economic stimulus or recovery being led by the governments, which is green, for which governments or SOEs raise financing, which can be used to provide exactly the issue that you have, which is how do you make an infrastructure project, a water or a transport project, which is not looking very attractive to a private, let's say an infrastructure provider, a PPP operator. To make it more attractive, you have to do something with reducing the capex cost of it, for which the government could come in and provide a support, or to reduce the revenue risk in the project because of the issues that you mentioned, that the overall economies are a little weak. So difference. Even for SMEs which are out and you're trying to create jobs and you're trying to sustain them, their issue again is financing. So I'm not saying that an SME should go and raise a whole lot of commercial finance, which is expensive given their existing business model. They should be given some support. And you've already seen examples. We ourselves have suggested this in Indonesia to create a green bond funded fund from the government, which says we will provide 3 years financing to an SME at 0%, which will then go up in stages. So you're trying to take away the financing shock that they all are facing for a few years. The only way you can do that is if government steps in. And I've seen this already happen, I think, in Thailand, where they're talking about an SME recovery fund, supporting the SMEs with government funding, but smartly, so that their support is there for a few years and then slowly the support goes away. So it's basically akin to saying, we're going to give you support, but it's not a grant, it's a revolving 0% loan, something like that. Hope that helps.
Thank you so much, Anuj. I see we have a comment from Sonomi here. Yeah, she was thinking like, how do we better to, how can we sort of make, define more clearly social and inclusion. Although she put the comment to you, Anuj, maybe Grace can say something because she also touched upon the issue of social and inclusion. So basically, how can we get more clarity on what is meant by social inclusion and also gender? Grace?
Sorry, I was muted. I was talking. Yeah.
Sorry,
Thanks,
no
Bernard. Thank you, Bernard. Actually, I agree with Anuj on this point. It seems that in terms of the impacts, the social can cover relatively a wider range of impacts, and then the green finance seems to be more focused. And then this actually has the pros and cons. So many of the stuff can be issued under social, but this also triggers some measurement issues, unlike green, which can be relatively clearly defined. So what the impact might be. Social impact measurement has been a challenge. There are a few frameworks discussing how to management and measure social impacts, but still a lot needs to be done to in terms of how to better quantify the impacts, how to define them properly. So I think this market still needs more clarification and definition and framework to guide the development. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Grace. I see that David has a question again. Maybe David, please, what's your question?
Yeah, thank you, Bernard. No, sorry, I don't want to monopolize, but yeah, it's a question for Anuj about what I was curious about the definition we adopt for green, with the sort of climate plus, and whether that's there's sort of a consensus on that framework within green finance more generally. It seems, given climate change is going to have such a big impact on the environment generally, I was not sure, why we impose the additional requirements beyond greenhouse gas emissions. Would also be very interested in your thoughts on whether for smaller countries, maybe the smaller countries within the GMS, the pros and cons of sort of following in Indonesia's footsteps with national funds, national schemes, and so on, and then how that would fit with the ACGF that we've set up. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's really good question, David. So the green finance definition that we've put in here is so there is no one definition of green finance. People just say let's green the world, and it could mean 1,000 different things. But for green finance, there are discussions, or let's say definitions which have been developed at the EU level, and we looked at that when we defined it. Now, this is not an ADB definition; this is an ACGF definition that we used, and it's not prescriptive, but it is there to guide what this means. Now, climate finance, which is obviously greenhouse gases, has a certain connotation, and that's good. But there are certain areas where we are trying to say proactively we want to have an impact on more. So yes, climate impact will catch, or greenhouse gas emissions reductions, the indicator will catch a lot of different aspects that you're trying to finance, but some things may not. And one area that is emerging very heavily from that is oceans, where sometimes it doesn't map very clearly to greenhouse gases, though you could look at it from the carbon sinks perspective. And so this is a little broader because the financing can flow according to this, not just into one indicator, but into a taxonomy. So there's a whole taxonomy for green that is actually probably better to talk about, which talks about sectors where it can go, as well as indicators which need to be applied to those sectors. So the terminology, etc., now is a little wider, a little broader than the climate definitions. Having said all of this, we develop a lot of these definitions and taxonomies talking to the climate change team. But remember, at the end of the day, this is not climate or green, this is finance. And so we are trying to make the green finance definition much more about leveraging capital from different sources for an impact on climate and environment. And that's sort of the rationale for green. So it's just a little broader. And you know, it seems to have created a credible space in the markets, because people are talking about financing green, which is quite broad sometimes, and you can touch many different areas which you may not always be able to touch with climate. Now, you know, whether we go forward and create a specific blue finance definition or something, maybe then, your question will be right. We shouldn't be adding more and more things, but generally the green definition has created a lot of interest for investors. I'd use that. I forget your second question, David.
Yeah, it was about, thank you for answering the first part. Yeah, I just wanted to seek your view about the issues for smaller countries in terms of setting up national green financing schemes. Either, in Cambodia's case, the government's looking at tapping GCF to create a national scheme that would basically blend long-term and concessional finance with the banks, the commercial. Yeah. Obviously, you presented on the Indonesia model. I just wonder if you could share your thoughts on the issues or suitability of national approaches for smaller countries in terms of tapping finance.
Yeah, I don't see any difference between a big country and a small country in the concept of setting up these catalytic facilities. There is a difference in terms of how you apply the money. That's the difference. So you may find, and as an example, I'll talk about the viability gap fund that we at ADB, I was leading the PPP initiative for India. That had viability gap funds which were different according to sectors, which you can apply the same model for Cambodia versus Indonesia. So the implicit aspect here is that you may need a more concessional financing facility or a more risk-taking facility in a Cambodia versus Indonesia, but I would argue that it would be more sector-specific in terms of how you apply the money. Now, I think, so one is in terms of how you use the money would be differently. The second is in terms of the ability of the country to raise the money. Now, it could be argued that, based on credit ratings, a certain country may be able to raise more interest from global investors at, some sort of a, competitive pricing versus a smaller country, perhaps. But there it could be funded more by philanthropic, multilateral funds. So the composition of the money into a fund may also change depending on a country's ratings in the global markets. Thanks.
Thank you, Anuj. So looks like we have another question here from Omar, and it says that, do social bonds promote privatization of public services to the exclusion of the poor and vulnerable, and inherent commodification of the population? Any positive example? So is this something, Grace, because this is all more on social bonds. Would you like to take that question?
Hi, Bernard. Yes. It actually seems that in Asia, it is not still quite the case. As I said, it seems that Asia's social bond is still dominated by SME sector. And then I fully agree with Anush. Actually, there can be more public investment that guide the demand, and the more demand and more issuance can be guided towards other public service like housing and education and sanitation. Yeah, so still not quite there as your question indicated.
Maybe I can just quickly add to what Grace is rightly saying. It's worth looking at the social bond framework that we've helped develop for NHA Thailand. And again, there's a little bit of a difference between a social bond framework, which says to investors, we are going to use your money for social impacts, which could be SDG impacts. And in the NHA case, it actually says it's for affordable housing. So it's absolutely not excluding any margin of society. In fact, it is meant to improve the SDG indicators. So a good social bond framework would simply say that we're improving indicators which should actually include proactively the poor and marginalized. That's what the money is meant for. But it could, of course, have an issue in terms of commercial returns. And so then you'd have to de-link the money that is raised and the entity which has raised it. So if it's a government, they could still afford to pass it on to fairly non-commercial projects, your very poor affordable housing projects. That's possible. And I don't think I've seen any framework where you're promising an investor that that money that is being raised will be used for privatization. I don't think that will ever happen. Or it won't be that explicit. It will be more in terms of, is it a more commercial project or a less commercial project, if that helps.
Thank you so much, Anush and Grace, for taking up that query. And I would like to thank everyone for participating. And this has been an extremely fruitful and rich discussion. We are now reaching the time for the coffee break. So we will create a breakout room for those who wants to join us for a virtual coffee. For the remainder of the people who may prefer not to join, if you want to do something else, they can stay in the main room. So we'll keep the room open, the main room open, and then we will be rejoining everyone back at 3:05. So please come back at 3:05 because we have also a very exciting thing, because like one issue that we always been thinking is what's happening to SME in Asia from the pandemic. And we're going to find out. So we got two speakers. We're going to be talking about that. One specifically on Vietnam, and one is the more general survey on the region. So please join us back at 3:05. Exciting discussion ahead. Stay in this room, or those who are interested can click on the link, and then they can join us for a virtual coffee. This is just like, as you say, more for networking. Thank you again, Grace, and thank you again, Anush. Wonderful presentation, truly insightful, and I think everyone really appreciate that. Can we give them a virtual applause? I don't even know how do we do a virtual applause.
I can hear the applause. Thank you.
You can hear the applause. Yeah, you gotta put the Mexican wave video or GIF or something. Thank you. So please join us in the coffee. If not, stay in this main room, and we'll be back here at 3:05. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Yes, we are all nice and on time for session 2, which is going to start in 3 minutes. Christina, ¿cómo está? Are you ready?
Hello. Yes, I'm ready. How are you? How is
Good.
everyone?
Very good. I'm going to shut up now.